So let's talk about some of the real-world examples that we're going to encounter in this course. So substantively, we're going to focus on topics in the social sciences and humanities. These are some of the questions we're going to ask ourselves and answer in this course. One of them is, do kids think sports is important for being popular? Or do kids think that money or good looks is more important for being popular? Were men more likely than women to die on the Titanic? And another question we'll talk about is, could we have predicted who won the 2008 presidential election in the United States? These are all questions that social scientists and humanists have actually asked and addressed, and that we're going to explore in this course. Let's focus on a little bit on this last question about predicting who won the 2008 presidential election in the United States. In 2008, the two presidential candidates were Barack Obama and John McCain. This is a map of the election results. In the United States, the president wins based on the number of states that he or she wins overall. And so in this map, the blue states are those states that Barack Obama won, meaning he got a greater percentage of votes in those states, and the red states are those that John McCain had won. But let's suppose you go back in time to October 2008. This was before the election in 2008. In the United States, the election is held in November. So let's go back just 1 month previous to the election and say you are a political analyst, a political scientist, and you collect data on the characteristics of U.S. states, and you want to predict who will win what state. Will John McCain win or Barack Obama? And this is a kind of analysis that people have actually conducted in the past, and people continue to conduct in order to predict electoral outcomes. But let's step back and say, you have a research assistant for this project. How does your research assistant organize all these observations about all these different states? Because you need to organize your data before you can analyze it. Well, in statistics, we have a very transparent way of organizing data. We organize data into something called a data set or data frame. A data set is the same as a data frame. The rows of the data set are called cases or observational units. Sometimes the rows are referred to as simply observations. The columns of this data set are called variables. Variables are simply characteristics or traits of the cases. To put it another way, each row is a different person or state or other kind of observational unit, and each column is some kind of characteristic or trait for each one of those observational units. So this is the data set that our research assistant has collected for looking at U.S. states. The cases are U.S. states, and the variables, the columns, are the characteristics of U.S. states. When we have a data set or data frame, we like to keep track of the cases, especially when we have a very large data set of 1,000 or 1,000,000 different rows, then it's important to keep track of your different observational units. So in our case, we have 50 states. It's not particularly large, but it's still useful to keep track of the different rows. What we use to keep track of the different rows is we use this little letter I. And this little letter I is an index, and each row has a different value of I. So you might say, well, what is the case or observational unit if I equals 5? Well, that's California. That's I equals 5 refers to that entire row. What is the case if I equals 49? Well, you just go down to the row labeled 49, and you see that that row is in fact Wisconsin. One question you might ask is, how many cases, how many observational units do I have? Well, that is just simply the total number of rows. We call that a little n when we're talking about a sample of data. So our data set in this case says n equals 50 cases. The index that we use goes from I equals 1 to I equals n, where n is the total number of rows. It's the total sample size for a sample of data. So in this case, n is 50 because we have 50 states. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that there are many different kinds of cases that you will encounter in your research and in your analysis of certain kinds of data. Cases, that is the rows of the data set, they can be everything from respondents who answer a survey to subjects involved in an experiment to records of transactions or different kinds of inanimate objects. If you're a historian, each row, each observational unit might actually be a different historical event. So in the social sciences and humanities, we encounter lots of different kinds of observational units. But in general, you will encounter that the rows are typically people and the variables are typically characteristics of people. That's because in the social sciences and humanities, our subject matter often focuses on people. So let's think about some of the columns of the data set that we have for our data set of US states in 2008. Each of the columns, they're different variables or characteristics of the state. So that first column is called state. That's the name of the US state. The next column is region, so that's just the geographic region, whether the state is in the west or south. Then we also have this column for population. This variable gives the population in millions for each state. And then we have this variable high school. That gives the percent who graduated from high school for each state. So these variables are different characteristics for each observational unit, each case. One thing you should keep in mind is that you should be careful of the units of measurement for each of your variables. So for example, if we look at our data set, you might ask, well, what is the population of Alabama? That's that first row. You should keep in mind that it is not 4.53 people, it is 4.53 million people. That's because the units are in millions. So if it's unclear what the units are for different variables, you should always ask the person who collected or organized the data.